Hello everyone. In this lecture we are going to discuss studies that combine the characteristics that we have been talking about. We're going to talk about studies that have multiple levels or clusters, along with having longitudinal attributes where measurements are repeated over time. We spent some time talking about longitudinal studies. We talked about studies with a single level of clustering, and we talked about studies with multiple levels of clustering, and so now we will deal with all of them at the same time. So this is a multi-level longitudinal study. This is a very complex design. Complex designs require complex analysis plans, and in turn require complex power and sample size analyses. And this course is designed to teach you the skills that you need for the complex power and sample size analysis. We will define and learn how to recognize this new type of study, which is called a multi-level and longitudinal study. We will also stick to our usual pattern of instruction by then describing how to use these study designs to induce different types of correlation. Remember, a longitudinal study looks at multiple measurements of the same independent sampling unit over time. These measurements from the same independent sampling unit are correlated. Also, a multi-level study has two or more hierarchical layers, inducing correlation within these levels, groups, clusters, or whichever term you would like to use to describe these collections of members at the same level with similar experiences. The two kinds of correlation patterns we've discussed are both at play in studies with longitudinal and multi-level features, resulting in the response of independent sampling units in the studies to be related. Longitudinal features induce correlation over time, while multi-level features induce correlation within levels. It is our goal to be able to recognize the causes of this correlation and be able to account for them both in our study design and analysis. Of course, this course only talks about design. We do not go into the details about analysis. Let's look at an example. Here's a study with both multi-level and longitudinal features. This is a group randomized study, which, remember, is another way to say clusters randomized, where groups or clusters are randomized into treatments instead of individuals. So it is a group randomized multi-level longitudinal study to test a preventative alcohol use intervention. The study focused on urban, low-income, and multi-ethnic populations. For clarity of presentation, some of the details we present, as for most of our examples, are quite different from the published studies referenced. 61 schools were recruited for this study, and these schools were randomized into an intervention or control group. We can assume these schools were very far apart and could not communicate with each other. Each student's alcohol use was measured at the end of 6th, 7th, and 8th grades. So students were tracked over time and repeated measurements of their alcohol use were taken. Here you can see that the hierarchy takes place in this study, a multi-level nature. The 61 schools were randomized into the different treatments, either alcohol use, preventative intervention, or control. Within each school, there are classrooms. Within each classrooms, there are students. You can see the multiple layers of the hierarchy, and we assume that within a classroom, students share similar experiences and are correlated. We assume the same about classrooms within the same school. However, we also assume that the schools are independent of one another. So a classroom in school A is independent from a classroom in school B. And we assume that a student in school A is independent from a student in school B as well. The flowchart displays the longitudinal features of the study. First, the schools are randomized into treatment or control labeled standard here. Then each student's alcohol use is measured in 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade. Correlation is induced as multiple measurements are taken from the same students over time. The null hypothesis was that there is no difference in average alcohol use between schools that received the intervention and between schools that received the standard care. The study is aiming to assess the effectiveness of this alcohol use prevention intervention. The students were observed in their schools, with the independent sampling unit being school, as observations at each school were independent of observations at other schools in the study. The unit of observation was the measurement at one point in time for one student. The researchers were interested in looking at the pattern of the intervention across time. So within independent sampling unit factor is time. We also have within factor cluster members, with classrooms within schools and students within classrooms. The between factor here is treatment, with assignment to the intervention or control. Once again, here are the two types of correlation that are being induced by this multi-level longitudinal design. The correlation within clusters comes from the multi-level features, and the correlation due to repeated measurements comes from the longitudinal features. The correlation from clusters are a result of the shared experiences for classrooms within schools and students within classrooms. The correlation between measurements is a result of the same students being tracked and measured 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. Unfortunately, the project, which was called Northland Chicago, was found to be ineffective. The findings revealed the need for more subpopulation-specific intervention studies. Let's do a quick review. A multi-level and longitudinal study combines the features of multi-level studies and longitudinal studies we have talked about. It has multiple organizational levels and repeated measurements collected over time. This leads to two types of correlation we need to account for. The correlation that results from the repeated measurements collected over time from the same participants, and the correlation that results from the shared experiences within the levels or clusters. That's it for this lecture. Thank you for your time.